Welcome to our last lecture in the Arts and Humanities Fall Series hosted by the Foundation of Wayne Community College. On behalf of Adrian Northington, the Executive Director of the Foundation, Emily Bird, Diane Belmont, and myself, we thank you for attending our virtual lectures as we have had to adapt during the pandemic. We would not have been able to bring them to you without the technical expertise and many hours of support from Ken Jones and Andrew Stoops. Thank you so much, gentlemen. As in all our lectures, you will be able to post comments and questions in the YouTube's chat feature. If it is your first time posting, you will create a channel or an account which will be easy to complete. Just follow the directions. Emily Bird, at the end of our speaker's presentation, will read some of the questions posted in the chat. It is my pleasure to introduce Joanna Sierks-Smith tonight. She is not only one of our speakers, but she is also a supporter and a friend to our Arts and Humanities program in her position as the Associate Director for State Outreach for Carolina Public Humanities. Carolina Public Humanities has been a great partner for many years, assisting us by sending scholars from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and has collaborated with the Foundation to host their Carolina K-12 program here to bring rich resources to K-12 teachers. And not only does Joanna help us in that role, but she's a scholar. And so she's here tonight to share her expertise with us. She is a PhD candidate in the Department of Religious Studies at UNC with a focus on religion in America. She is currently researching religious elements found within the meatpacking industry and slaughterhouses. Before embarking on a doctorate in 2016, she earned her Master's of Arts in Religious Studies at UNC, and her thesis was Nature's Violent God in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek and Holy the Firm. So we may have to ask you to come and talk about Annie Dillard sometime, okay? She came south, leaving Connecticut College, where she obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies before coming to warmer climes. Joanna's educational journey is filled with fellowships, grants, and awards such as the Peck Teaching Award in 2017, Humanities Pathways Award in 2018, and in the summer of 2019, she received the Wintergren Fellowship, Foundation grant that has sponsored a lot of her dissertation work. She has been very active in the graduate department, including serving as chair of the Graduate Teaching Committee. Joanna has taught a number of courses, which I would be very interested in these. As a teaching fellow at UNC, some titles are Messianic Movements in American History, Religion, Nature, and the Environment. She has presented at many venues, including conferences and as guest lecturers in classes. Joanna lives in Saxapahaw, North Carolina. Did I get it right? With her husband, Ross, and she's actually fairly newlywed. She was able to get married before the pandemic, which was good. Joanna, we just thank you so much for being with us tonight. And so with that, enjoy Joanna Sierks-Smith's lecture, Religious Freedom in American History. Thank you, Joanna.
Well, thank you so much, Charlotte, for that incredibly generous introduction. And thank you as well to Adrian, to Emily, to Diane, to the entire foundation team. It is truly an honor to be here with you tonight. So I want to open my talk this evening by considering a quote from the 2017 National Security Strategy, which was then reiterated in an executive order on international religious freedom that the Trump administration put out in June of 2020. So it reads, "Our founders understood religious freedom not as a creation of the state, but as a gift of God to every person and a right that is fundamental for the flourishing of our society." Now, the sentiment here that religious freedom is a fundamental religious right is a very commonly held one in America today, and indeed is a notion that has been absolutely foundational to American self-conception since the time of our founding, and in ways before. So you're in no way going to hear me dispute that claim tonight. But what my presentation will focus on is the other half of this quotation, the claim that religious freedom is not a creation of the state. Because what we find when we look at American history is that even if the state did not create this basic right of religious freedom, it is, out of thin air, it is implicated in a number of ways. The state gets to define what counts as religion. The state gets to enforce religious freedom, and the state is tasked with developing a set of general laws and regulations that in a pluralistic society are inevitably going to intersect and even clash with some citizens' religious practices in unexpected ways. So I'm not going to be able to give a comprehensive blow-by-blow of how religious freedom in the US has developed. We could spend an entire semester talking about that together. And I'm also not going to be able to cover all of the wide-ranging aspects of American life that are impacted by religious freedom: prisons, schools, courthouses, hospitals, homeless shelters, cemeteries, what takes place in the privacy of our own homes. But instead, I'm going to tackle three main goals with you. First, I want to together examine some of the key debates around religious freedom that were taking place in early America, and to examine the experiments that were already underway at the time of the country's founding. Then I'd like to move on to highlight some of the persistent challenges to enacting this lofty ideal of religious freedom. And then finally, together, I want to turn to some recent legislative changes that have made this issue of religious freedom into a heated and truly divisive political issue just in the last several decades. But first, let's dive into colonial America. Starting with the South. So in the 13 colonies, there was a chance for religious and state leaders to experiment with new modes of governance. And looking at the colonies, we can see a number of different models for what religious freedom could look like, or religious tolerance, perhaps, is a better phrase to use, as that was more often the case back then. And I want to go region by region to look at how religion was dealt with by colonial governments. But first, I do want to set the scene a little bit. So some groups coming to the US in the 1600s were coming simply in search of wealth, of land, of new opportunity. Others were coming very explicitly to flee religious persecution. And Europe at this time was still convulsing with religious violence. This was a time of intense sectarianism, which is to say, Protestantism in particular had splintered into a number of different kind of warring sects with intense animosity towards one another and also with huge animosity towards Catholicism in particular. So against that backdrop, let's start with the American South. So in Virginia, the Carolinas, and in Maryland, the established church was Anglicanism, the Church of England. That was the official religion, but it meant different things at different moments. So in early Virginia, starting in 1607, this was a very draconian established church. Church attendance was mandatory at Anglican services, and on the books there was a rule that you could be executed if you missed church 3 times. Now, we don't have any evidence that that was actually enforced or enacted, and authorities very quickly eased up on those super strict religious regulations. But still, throughout the time of the colonial period, up through the Revolution, in fact, in some places, taxpayer dollars were going to fund Anglican churches and to pay for Anglican ministers. Now, part of the reason that it was so difficult for a state religion to be successfully enforced in the South was because of how spread out it was. it meant that there was quite literally geographic room for other religions to come in, and this happened. In particular, Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians began filtering into the South. So what you see here in the far image is a picture of a circuit rider. And circuit riders in early America were ministers who would ride around between frontier settlements, all of which were too small to have their own church or to have their own minister preaching. And this was a practice started by the Methodists and continued over centuries through the practice of revivals. Now, Maryland, among these colonies, stands out for the explicit safeguards that it had for freedom of religion. In 1649, Maryland passed an act concerning religion, also called the Maryland Toleration Act. And this protected Christians of all stripes, but it specifically protected Catholics, which was a real exception to the norm during the colonial period in America. And I will note that Maryland periodically suspended this act of toleration during moments of serious social strife. So the idea of religious freedom was still in flux, but it gave Maryland the reputation of being a safe haven for Catholics. One last issue that I want to draw everyone's attention to about religious freedom in the southern colonies is the question of how to deal with religious freedom for enslaved people. There was an enormous tension felt by the white majority, between, on the one hand, the logic that part of the mission of slavery was to Christianize enslaved people. That was part of the public justification. And yet at the same time, slaveholders had an enormous concern that full and unsupervised access to the Bible would give enslaved people tools to argue for their own emancipation, and that giving them the space to have religious services would give them time to politically organize. So what wound up happening was that enslaved people found ways to seize their own religious freedoms, often by creating what were called praise houses, as pictured here, and hush harbors, where they could worship outside of the watchful gaze of slave masters and where they could weave components of West African religious traditions in with Christianity. Now, if we move north a little, we begin to see a very different kind of experiment, an experiment in pluralism. In New York and Pennsylvania, we don't see established churches. So let's start with New York. When New Amsterdam was founded, what would come to be Manhattan, it was a radically tolerant colony. There were Dutch Calvinists, there were French Huguenots, Jews, Quakers, everyone living side by side. As you can see here, we have an example of the very first synagogue established in the United States in what is now Manhattan. When the governor of New York at one point proposed cracking down on religious freedoms in the 1640s, he wanted to kick everyone out of the colony who was not a member of the Dutch Reformed Church, which would have really lowered the population. He was overruled by his advisors, and he was overruled in very simple economic terms. New Amsterdam was rapidly becoming an economic powerhouse specifically because of its religious diversity. It could have traders from all over Europe who were peacefully coexisting and peacefully making deals with one another. Now, another great example of early pluralism is in Pennsylvania, but it was embraced there for a very different rationale. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, who was himself a Quaker who had been imprisoned several times because of his faith. Now, this image here on the right shows an engraving from the 17th century of a Quaker meeting. And if you can see, what it pictures is a woman speaking to a group of mixed gender. So part of the reason that Quakers were considered so dangerous by leaders across Europe and by the colonies was because they believed in this radical idea that all humans were equal. The Quakers were among the earliest advocates for women's rights as well as for emancipation. But of course, this posed an enormous threat to social and to political order. When Penn founded Pennsylvania, he wanted to ensure that Christians of diverse denominations, including Quakers, could worship there freely. And this was also the first colony to make any kind of concerted effort to safeguard Native American religions. And now we move up to New England, and the plot continues to thicken. New England's colonies, with the exception of Rhode Island, were set up as theocracies, pure and simple. The Puritans did not, as many of us were taught in school, come to the New World to establish a society built on religious freedom. They came here to claim religious freedom for their own religion, to set up their own society based on Calvinism, but they saw any dissenters as posing a threat to that world. The church structure and the civil government were absolutely fused in New England's colonies. Churches were state buildings, ministers were paid by the state, civil magistrates were tasked with punishing religious deviants. Now, I have to say, there are some surprisingly positive things that wound up coming out of this. One that I will point to is the first public education mandate, which came out of Puritan New England. This particular law was called the Old Deluder Satan Act of 1647. The Puritans' thinking went like this. Satan has a vested interest in keeping children illiterate, so they can't read the Bible. If they can't read the Bible, how are they supposed to know how to follow him? So the only safeguard against that is going to be universal literacy. So this law mandated community schooling for all children, both boys and girls, so that they could read scripture. Every town with over 100 inhabitants had to set up a grammar school. So that's an example of how theocracy seemed to work for the greater good in small ways. There were also, obviously, some horrific ways in which this played out. Heretics could be exiled, could be tortured, and could be executed. Free thinkers like Roger Williams were banished. Quakers were publicly hung on the Boston Common. And in fact, it took an intervention from England before these harsh persecutions came to a stop. England passed the Act of Toleration in 1689, which granted protections to nonconformists, although it did specifically exclude Catholics from that. But I want to highlight in that act, the Act of Toleration, this word toleration. This was not an act of religious freedom. What you can hear in it is that there's still understood to be a dominant religion, a correct religion. It's simply that that religion is being asked to put up with, to tolerate other faiths. So it's a step in the right direction, but it's still certainly worlds away from the more egalitarian kind of pluralistic society that our founders aimed to set in place. But the founders had this wide array of experiments at their fingertips about how states could handle religious diversity. And they also had at their fingertips a set of various rationales for why to care about religious freedom, which we'll go to in one sec. I do want to point out here, before I move on, this page from an alphabet book that was used in the Puritan colonies. And you can see A is for Adam's fall. We sinned all. So even the public education system was still being used as a tool of kind of encouraging a religious homogeneity. So as the founders were thinking about the models of religious diversity at play in the colonies, they also had at their fingertips a set of different reasons about why we should want religious freedom in the first place. And I think asking that question right now feels very strange, because we all think we know. It's because it's a natural right. It's because we are all born having it. But at the time of the country's founding, the rationale behind religious freedom was very much up for debate. So I want to go through a couple different answers to that question that were certainly on our founders' minds. Number one, maybe we just want religious freedom to protect the economy. Think back to that example of New York that we just spoke about. Creating the space for religious diversity, for Catholics, for Jews, for Presbyterians to all live and work together, frees up the country to have as many trading partners as possible. And to pick just one dominant religion forecloses those economic possibilities. Now, a connected argument that was often made was, even if we don't want religious freedom, we need to find some way to stop religious violence. Religious wars, as I mentioned, had been wreaking havoc on Europe ever since the Reformation. And so some of the founders said, unless we find a really concrete way to safeguard against this, there's no way this democracy is not just going to crumble into warring religious states. This sectarianism is all too common. We've seen it before. Now, another line of thinking was that we need freedom of religion and a separation between church and state in order to protect the state from the corrupting influence of the church. This was a huge concern for many founding fathers because they worried that if a single religious group, or even if a single religiously zealous leader, were able to come into power, seize control of the young republic, representative democracy could easily crumble with the will of one religious group being imposed on the whole. Another line of thinking was the exact opposite of that. No, it's the state that poses a potential problem for religion. We need to protect churches from being corrupted by government influence. And this was a concern to folks like the Puritans, who believed that they were safeguarding a pure remnant of Christianity that could be easily corrupted if government officials were allowed to begin poking their fingers into church doctrine. Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, who was using the metaphor of a wall of separation way back in the 1600s, also argued with this logic. He said, if the government is allowed to start dictating matters of morality and of conscience, the pure doctrines of Christ stand no chance of making it through. And then we have this last idea, that we should have religious freedom simply to protect individual moral autonomy. And it's fascinating that although all of these factors played a huge role in our founders' thinking, this is the logic that winds up being enshrined in so many of our texts, and this is the one that winds up getting passed down through generations and through centuries. And this idea really reflects the Enlightenment leanings of our founding fathers, many of whom believed that reason alone gave humanity all of the tools that we needed to discover spiritual truths, which makes it really unnecessary for morality and for faith to be imposed from above. Now, at the time of the Revolution, about 98% of Americans of European descent were Protestant. And this is true of the Founding Fathers as well. Of the Founding Fathers, some were very religiously unorthodox, like Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, while there were others like Roger Sherman who were quite religious and quite orthodox. But across the board, they had a shared commitment to the idea that there had to be some way for the American people to stay virtuous, to in fact gain in their understanding of civic virtue in order for a democracy to work. People had to be able to work together to strive towards the good if they were going to be trusted to rule themselves. And the founders really trusted that the best way to achieve this kind of moral evolution, progression of culture, was to allow for the free exchange of ideas and the free competition of religion. They trusted this process would help religions to stay accountable and would allow individuals the space they needed to continue to interrogate the ideas that they were being handed. And again, this deeply reflects these Enlightenment ideals in which they were steeped. I also want to point out before we move on that this last rationale, that we should protect religious freedom simply because it's a natural right, is arguably the rationale that explains the push away from mere tolerance and into freedom. And this shift was absolutely critical to the founders. I'd like to read here a short excerpt from a letter by George Washington that really captures this distinction between tolerance on the one hand and full freedom on the other. So after Washington assumed the presidency, he was inundated with letters from religious groups, and in particular from religious minorities, basically asking him to affirm the principle of religious freedom, to affirm that the federal government would actually defend this liberty. And this was written in response to a letter he received from a synagogue in Rhode Island. He writes, "It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support." So what is he saying here? He's saying the logic behind tolerance is that it's an act of generosity on the part of the religious majority to let dissenters practice their religion. No, he says, the freedom of worship is a right, not a privilege that one religious group can give or can take away. So freedom of religion is enshrined in our Constitution through the First Amendment. And it's enshrined through these two different clauses, which have both been employed very differently in American legal history. First, we have the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And next we have the Free Exercise Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, this looks deceitfully simple, but it is really difficult to work it into the nitty-gritty of public life in a pluralistic society. So what I want to do now is to shift gears and to think together about just a few of the ways in which this is more complicated than it may initially seem. And what I want to demonstrate today is that religious freedom does not and cannot exist in isolation. It exists enmeshed in the context of general laws that govern American life, that aim to maintain safety and equality and general order. And it also exists enmeshed in our society and our culture, where there are religious majorities and minorities, where there are political and social movements that aim to shift how we feel about one group or another. So let's dive in. And I want to start here by considering some of the barest bones of religious freedom as it's laid out by the Constitution and as a response to what was happening in some of the colonies. So here are some fairly uncontroversial ways to apply the First Amendment that we can start with. Nobody should be denied residency or citizenship because of their religion. All houses of worship are allowed to be established. People should be allowed to hold public office regardless of their religious belief or lack thereof. And there is no state church funded by taxpayer dollars. Already, just in these 4 ideas, we hit some serious challenges that show us how difficult it is to actually institute changes. So let's go through this list again and think through those challenges. No one should be denied residency or citizenship because of their religion. Well, we've had various quota systems in place for immigration that certainly targeted specific religious groups, incidentally and at times intentionally. Of course, all of us here have witnessed the most egregious example of this in American history, the most egregious example of excluding one religious group, which is Trump's short-lived Muslim ban. On to the next. All houses of worship are allowed to be established. This is legally true, and yet attacks on Catholic churches, on black churches, on synagogues, on mosques, on temples, attacks that have at some times made the United States so hostile to certain religions that groups simply cannot establish places of worship. These all demonstrate how hard it is to simply institute a policy like this from above without the culture also embracing the fact that all religions are welcome here. So this raises a question about how culture needs to fit into this picture, which we'll return to in a little bit here. On to the next, holding public office regardless of religious belief. Now, at the time that the Constitution was ratified, a number of states were writing state constitutions that explicitly enshrined religious requirements for office, which meant that anyone seeking public office would have to swear an oath professing belief in a Trinitarian God, for example, belief in the divine inspiration of the Bible. North Carolina's version of this, which is technically still on the books, simply bans atheists from holding office. And the federal government did not intervene on this issue until 1961, based on the assumption that the First Amendment mostly restricts the federal government from establishing churches, but it's a state issue if they want to. But in 1961, the Supreme Court finally did rule that a Maryland law demanding that office holders take an oath of belief in a Christian God was unconstitutional. And we get to the last one. There is no state church funded by taxpayer dollars. This one has also been a real slow one to get off the ground, as it was originally not applied to states but only to the federal government. State churches were authorized by many constitutions, especially, unsurprisingly, in New England. And what this meant was that the church, as well as any connected religious schools of a particular denomination, would be supported by tax dollars. Now, there are a few really interesting examples of states who are kind of trying to straddle the line between embracing religious freedom but still having an established church. So, for example, in South Carolina, in early America, the state would give taxpayer funding to multiple denominations. They said, as long as we're paying all the churches, we're not showing preference to one. Vermont did a different system. They said, okay, we're going to let each town vote to pick which religion they want their money to go to. And if anyone really doesn't like the way that vote lands, you can fill out these forms and be exempted from this tax. So the move towards disestablishment on a state level came very gradually, came on a state-by-state basis, and honestly did not come from the federal government saying, hey, this is unconstitutional. Rather, it came from citizens saying, we're kind of sick of paying these taxes for churches we don't even go to. Oof. So this is the easy part of religious freedom, and we can see that already it is getting pretty thorny. But it gets more complicated. Do we have a right to take days off from work in order to worship? To grieve our dead according to a specific religious tradition? Do we have a right to access sacred sites, even if they're maybe owned by someone else? Do we have a right to marry whoever our religion allows, or to have sexual relations with whoever our faith dictates? Can we educate our children however we please? And I would add, can we ask the government to pay for it still? Can we deny our children medical care? And if so, can we be excused from punishment if something goes wrong? Can we sacrifice animals? Now, none of these are hypotheticals. These are all religious cases that have been brought up before higher courts in recent years. And just about all of them have been brought up by minority religious groups, by Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, practitioners of Santeria, Native American religious groups. So something to bear in mind here is that in early America, even though many religious groups joined the founders in opposing formal state churches, they still assumed correctly that a general Protestant attitude and sensibility would continue to underpin public institutions like schools, like the legislature. And many of our general laws continued to reflect that Protestant sensibility. So until a shift quite recently, which we'll talk about in a bit, many of the cases that came up before state courts around questions of religious freedom were raised by minority religious groups who were simply pointing out ways in which the Protestant majority was actually being favored by general laws. And although I don't have time tonight to go down this wormhole, many of these cases actually wound up revealing ways in which the courts had defined religion itself in very Protestant terms as being primarily about inner belief rather than about ritual, rather than about bodily practices, rather than being about sacred space. So that's something I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A if anyone is interested. Now I want to take a moment to highlight one common rhetorical move that has been used throughout American history to pay lip service to religious freedom while actually undermining it. One common trope we see cropping up again and again is that there are some religions who are simply, in their nature, anti-democratic. And if we believe them to be anti-democratic and to therefore pose a threat to the very underpinnings of religious freedom, well then we have to exclude them from our nation, exclude them from this pluralism. Now this charge has been leveled against a number of groups in American history. For a long time, it was loudly leveled against Catholics, with the suspicion being, when push comes to shove, Catholics will simply obey the Vatican. This is widely considered to have hit a breaking point with the election of JFK as our first Catholic president, which at the time was very controversial. But before that, it was a very potent tool for undermining both Catholic voters and Catholic leaders. And you can see in this cartoon, which was published by Harper's in 1875, we have Roman Catholic clergy depicted as crocodiles climbing up the Potomac River, presumably to attack Washington. And this cartoon really sums up well the sentiments behind a huge wave of anti-Catholic nativism in the 1800s and early 1900s. This charge has also often been leveled against American Jews. The infamously anti-Semitic text, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, spread this myth that a secret group, a Jewish cabal, ran the world economy through backroom dealings and would always promote its own benefits over those of other Americans. This myth has transformed over time, but it has not disappeared. In fact, since the founding of Israel, there have been kind of a new genre of accusations made against that Jewish representatives or Jewish voters have a dual national loyalty to Israel and to the United States. Now, of course, this is inaccurate for a number of reasons. First of all, some American Jews feel very strongly connected to Israel, while others completely disavow it. But it's also nonsensical in the way that it treats identity as a zero-sum game. We are in a country of immigrants where all of us have differing ancestral ties to different places. And to assume that connections to another country take away loyalty from the United States just does not make sense. Now here's a really cool image of the circuit riding rabbi. So think back to that picture we saw in one of the first slides of the circuit riding Methodist minister. This is a spin on that. This was done in North Carolina in the 1950s, and it was spearheaded by a North Carolina rabbi who said, hey, I know that scattered throughout this state, there are Jewish families who are not in enough of a population density to have a local synagogue, to have a local rabbi. So I'm going to do exactly what Christians have been doing for a century, and I'm going to take the rabbi and take the synagogue to them. So it just about doesn't get more American than that. In recent years, this allegation has also often been thrown at Muslims. Here it's mostly caricatures of Sharia law that have been used to paint Muslims as somehow less than fully American. And it's this caricature in part that President Trump was able to harness in order to gain popular support for his Muslim ban. And I want us all to remember that many of the people who supported that ban would also profess to be enormous supporters of religious freedom. But by claiming that Islam is incompatible with democracy and is incompatible with religious freedom, they could square that circle. They could justify Trump's attempts to keep Muslims out of the country. Here we have a prayer service in New York, led by a woman. This was a very big deal. Now, last but not least, this charge of some religions simply not being compatible with democracy has often been leveled against new religious movements, or the word that's more often used to refer to them, cults. And this includes everyone from groups like the Shakers, who we mostly now think of as farmers, as furniture makers, to groups like the Branch Davidians or like People's Temple. And perhaps the most telling example of this would be Mormons, who were once so reviled by other Americans that they were literally run out of the territories by a lynch mob. And now they've been so thoroughly accepted back into the religious and the cultural mainstream that the Republican Party was able to nominate a Mormon, Mitt Romney, for president. Now, with the exception of Mormonism, these charges against different religions are, of course, deeply inflected with racism and xenophobia. They've been connected to violent attacks on places of worship, and they represent a dangerous thread that runs through American history, of Americans wanting to have it both ways, wanting to embrace religious freedom, in name at least, but also wanting homogeny, wanting to exclude those that are branded as other. Now, quickly here, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit here to move on to talk about some more recent legislative developments. All right, as I had mentioned, in the mid-1900s, many of the cases that came to the Supreme Court were brought there by minority religious groups or by secular groups that were contesting a Protestant norm. And that has shifted recently, with evangelicals and with the broader religious right coming together to defend what they see as religious freedom being threatened by secularism. Now, already there are broad exemptions in place for religion. There are tax exemptions for religious organizations. There are lax regulations around religious schools. But over the past decades, we have seen a growing expansion of those religious exceptions, of this privileged relationship of some religious groups to the law. And this expansive enactment of religious freedom has been fueled by a new movement over the last few decades of American legislation, which has played out largely through the legislative tact of what are known as Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. Now, without any background information, you can already probably hear the rhetoric contained within that. Restoration Acts. They're implying, they are assuming that religious freedom has eroded over the course of American history and that it needs to be restored to its former glory. Now, RFRAs, as these Religious Freedom Restoration Acts came to be known, have become politically toxic. And so in the last decade, we can see a shift in the language around them. But first, I want to talk through how this kind of legislation took root in the first place, and to focus on a few specific watershed legal moments that laid the groundwork for this more expansive set of religious freedom. And I think if we can get a better sense of why this kind of legislation is spreading, we can also see how it has become such a tool of division between the right and the left. And please bear with me, we're going to get into the weeds a little here on a few legal cases, but it will be worth it. So by the 1980s, the American courts were really backing off on enforcing the First Amendment. And in particular, the Supreme Court had started to interpret the First Amendment as only forbidding the government from passing regulations that were intended to focus on one particular religious group. So laws that were designed to discriminate against religious groups would get knocked down, but those general laws that only accidentally discriminated, the Supreme Court was generally saying, okay, those can stay. And an example of this came in 1990, when a case came before the Supreme Court disputing the application of the First Amendment. This case originated in Oregon, where two members of the Native American church, one of them, Al Smith, is pictured here, had been fired from their jobs for testing positive for peyote. Now, they argued peyote use is a central religious ritual for us. We cannot be constitutionally punished for this. But the state of Oregon argued, well, we have a generally applicable law against drug use. It's not intended to target you as Native Americans, so it's not discriminatory. And the Supreme Court upheld that decision. They said, you're right, there's nothing discriminatory about this law. Now, and this is critical, what happened after this in terms of peyote use? It did not stop. Instead, across the nation, members of the Native American church petitioned state governments for specific exemptions to be written into state law to allow for the use of peyote in rituals. And across the nation, states did this. So it's a very targeted way of expanding religious freedom. It's specific, it addresses that one issue, and it's done by legislatures instead of by courts. But to the public and to religious leaders around the country, this Supreme Court ruling really marked a dangerous precedent because the First Amendment had not successfully protected these plaintiffs. So clearly the courts could not be trusted to apply it vigorously enough. So what needed to happen? A new piece of legislation. So in 1993, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed. And it was remarkably bipartisan. It was supported almost unanimously by Congress before being signed into law by President Clinton. And that shouldn't be surprising, but it does feel a little surprising today. But no one ever lost an election by saying they stood up for religious freedom. This reminds me of the clause that's still in North Carolina's Constitution, forbidding atheists from holding office. No one's going to enforce it, but no representative is going to stand up and be the one who asks that it be removed, because no one wants to mark themselves as being against religion. Well, at this time, too, nobody wanted to stand up and say, I'm against restoring religious freedom. So this bill was an explicit response to the Smith case. And this act states that generally applicable laws can burden religious freedom just as much as if they were intended to do so. And so it sets a new standard. Under this law, unless the following two criteria are met, a religious exception must be granted. And so in layman's terms, these two requirements are: the law's goals need to be immensely important, and the specific law as written has to be written in the least burdensome, the most religiously tolerant way that it possibly could be while still achieving its goal. And as we'll see, those are really broad criteria. And they suddenly brought literally every law under potential scrutiny for incidentally burdening someone's free exercise of religion. So this guaranteed much more sweeping religious protections than the First Amendment, and it made it much easier for religious organizations and institutions to argue that their free exercise was being unduly burdened. Now, instead of having to prove that the First Amendment was being violated, religious actors could simply say the terms of this RFRA were being violated. In 1997, a case came before the Supreme Court that challenged this, simply by referencing the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Now, the plaintiff here was a Catholic bishop, and what he was asking to do was simply to literally build an addition onto his church. Historic zoning laws said he couldn't do it. So pointing to the RFRA, he said, it is a substantial burden on my faith for me not to be able to enlarge this church. This court case made it clear just how far the RFRA had pushed the limits of what could count as religious freedom. So in the Supreme Court ruling on this case, they actually said, this RFRA is not constitutional. You cannot, it is fundamentally changing, expanding what religious freedom means, and that is not the job of the legislature. So they struck it down at a state level and at a local level, leaving only a remnant in place at the federal level. Now that was still a potent remnant, which came to impact the Hobby Lobby case. But as soon as the Supreme Court ruled on this, people began to freak out again about religious freedoms being taken away. So states began passing their own versions of bills that were modeled on the federal RFRA. So here is a chart from 2015, and it shows which states have passed this kind of legislation. 21 states now have RFRAs. This is a very widespread movement. And nearly half the states in the nation have these sweeping religious exceptions to general laws. So for some scholars, this feels like a bit of a Pandora's box that makes it very difficult to apply general laws as soon as an individual or an organization says, I have a religious reason not to comply with that. I came across this cartoon, and I think it sums up how some feel about RFRAs, which is a concern that this wall of separation is being overrun not by the government, but also by churches and by religious organizations demanding more freedoms. So if you think back to the slide where we were discussing what different motivators were to have religious freedom, remember there were the folks who said we need to protect government from the church, and there were the folks who said we need to protect the church from the government. I think this is a moment in American history where we're seeing the tension between those two goals. Now I'm going to skip ahead here a bit. I'm going to skip Hobby Lobby, but if anyone is interested in that, I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. And I'm going to skip ahead to one interesting example of the RFRA in action, which happened in Indiana in 2015. So on a state level, RFRAs very quickly became almost exclusively a tool for enabling discrimination against the LGBTQ community, and also potentially against unwed couples, against single mothers, and against religious minorities. And perhaps the most explosive example of this was in Indiana in 2015, when then Governor Mike Pence signed it into law. Now, this RFRA drew on exactly the same language as the federal version. However, building on the recent Hobby Lobby case, it defined person, the person whose religious freedoms were being protected, as an individual, an organization, or a corporation, whether for-profit or not-for-profit. So basically, anyone or any configuration of people. Now, a lot of people were very upset about this. And in particular, something we began to see in Indiana was a massive mobilization of companies. Leaders from places like Apple and Subaru and the NCAA all began speaking out against this law and began pulling out of Indiana, losing the state millions of dollars in business revenue. So if you think back again to those motives, perhaps economic motives could be a driver here. To opponents of this law, the lessons learned from it seemed very straightforward. It will only hurt a state to pass a discriminatory law like this. But to supporters of this legislation, a very different lesson became clear. They felt, oh, this shows we need to really double down, but switch strategies a little bit. So starting in 2016, we see a shift from this legislation being called RFRAs to being called First Amendment Defense Acts. And you can hear again that rhetorical difference in those two names. But the important actual difference between the two is that although RFRAs were generally used to allow discrimination on the grounds of religious freedom, they never explicitly mentioned same-sex marriage. The First Amendment Defense Act is very clear about it. Just as RFRAs were modeled on the original federal bill, so are state-level First Amendment Defense Acts modeled on the original federal bill. Now, the federal version of this was submitted in the summer of 2015, but it stalled out. Had it passed, it would have prohibited the federal government from taking discriminatory action against individuals or corporations for discriminating against others. I know we are running short on time now, so I just want to end here in thinking about where this train of legislation has dropped us off at. These First Amendment Defense Acts are still kicking around. Another version of the federal bill was brought forward in 2018, although that stalled in the Senate. But very interestingly, this kind of push to use the legislature to expand religious freedoms, and specifically the religious freedom to discriminate, has kind of started spinning its wheels in the last 4 years. And my suspicion here is that what it reflects is precisely the same logic that started this legislative trend in the first place, was concerns that the courts were not doing their job in upholding religious freedom. And I think under the Trump administration, the religious right had a lot more optimism that the courts could again be tasked with upholding religious freedom. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with this kind of legislation moving forward into the next 4 years. So I do recommend that you all kind of keep your ears to the ground on that. So lastly, I just want to end with a question. If a primary goal of religious freedom in early America was to bring the nation together, to make a unified people out of disparate religious communities, we should ask ourselves whether the current brand of legislation, the current tenor of the conversation around religious freedom is achieving that. Because when religious freedom starts being used as a tool of political division, then we have come right back full circle to the kind of sectarianism that our founders sought to avoid. All right, thank you so much.
Okay, Joanna, we do have a couple of questions.
All right.
What are your thoughts on the issue of religious beliefs of parents preventing their children from getting life-saving medical care? Where is the line?
You know, I think this is I understand why this is such a thorny issue. I think it is too important an issue to be left up to religious freedom. There are so many cases of children who have been seriously injured or who have died because they have been denied medical care for religious reasons that are sincerely held, that their parents sincerely believe that prayer will be the answer. And I do not think that the exemptions that are granted for religious motivations in those cases are compelling. But what I will say is that I think there is a huge middle ground between, on the one hand, giving parents autonomy to refuse their children medical care, and on the other hand, taking those children away, which has sometimes been the state's kind of opposite and equal reaction. And there are some very promising examples, some in Maine that I'm thinking of with new religious movements, where state officials were able to truly build a relationship with certain religious communities that did not believe in medical care, such that state officials could come in and periodically check on children, could have an open conversation, and if it seemed like there was a situation that was becoming dangerous at any point, could then insist that children get care. So that is such a delicate issue, and I think it needs to be dealt with in a really moderate way. What a great question.
Thank you. Is there a time when you can point to our landscape becoming more religiously diverse?
Was the question, is there a time when our state will become more religiously diverse?
Is there a time when you can point to our landscape becoming more religiously diverse?
What a great question, and yes, absolutely. So one moment I would point to would be in the mid-1900s when shifts in immigration laws simply allowed more people in from more places. I think so many of the kind of explosions of religious difference that we can see in our nation's history come from these moments where immigration policies shift. One other moment that I would point to, not as shifting populations, but as shifting kind of cultural consciousness, would be the World Parliament of Religions, which was an event that was held in the late 1800s in Chicago, I believe, that for the first time invited leaders from all different faiths around the world to come together and to discuss their faiths. And now the entire conference was still built on a kind of Protestant base. The assumption of many of the speakers, the Christian speakers, was that all religions are going to slowly evolve into Christianity. However, the lasting cultural influence of that event was that a lot of Americans who had never heard of Hinduism, who had never heard of Buddhism, who had never heard of Islam even, were suddenly exposed through news stories about this parliament to these new ideas. And even if they themselves didn't convert, would begin reading about them or would go to see a religious leader when they came through on a lecture circuit. And so I think that really laid the groundwork for religious diversity in a magnificent way.
Okay, I have one more question, but then we do have some people who want you to share more information about the Hobby Lobby dispute.
Oh, absolutely.
And also, how is religion defined? But let me ask you this last question first. Do you see a specific religious freedom amendment being proposed in the future to address contemporary issues such as religious discriminations and exemptions?
Religious discriminations and exemptions. You know, truthfully, no. I think there's going to be an enormous hesitance to do anything similar to the RFRA again, to a law that was that all-encompassing, that was intended to apply on a federal, on a state, on a local level, and that clearly had some serious unintended consequences, or at least consequences that I would guess, not all of the representatives who voted for that bill had in mind when they signed it. And so I suspect that moving forward, unless we have really politically consolidated government, you know, if the House and the Senate and the presidency are all the same party, perhaps we could see a bill like that. But I think in general, religious freedom is going to be dealt with in smaller and more precise and targeted ways.
Okay, so I had one more question come in from Dr. Kramer. How would you compare the current views of religious freedom in America with commitments to religious freedom in European, Middle Eastern, or Asian societies?
Ooh, I've got options. You know, let's go with Europe. And I'm picking that specifically because a good friend of mine who's European, and I talk about this a fair amount, because she comes from a country that has an established church. Her tax dollars do go to pay a church. She did have a religious school in her town that all the children attended, and yet she insists we had much more religious freedom there than we do here. And I think that's I'm so interested in why that might be. And one concern I have with making kind of a simple comparison between religious freedom in Europe and religious freedom in America is because I don't know how much of the tensions around religious freedom in America are a result of our diversity. And there are powerful examples of European countries like Germany, for example, which does now have much more religious diversity, France as well, much more religious diversity, and enormous tensions have emerged over what that means for the nation's identity. And so perhaps a kind of promising takeaway there is that, they've got established churches, we don't have established churches, but we're both dealing with the same very basic human issue, which is how do you handle difference? And it's difficult. I don't think there's one formula for doing it perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to share any information on the Hobby Lobby dispute?
I would be happy to talk a little bit about Hobby Lobby. Let me just switch over to a photo here of some protesters around Hobby Lobby. Here we go. So, Hobby Lobby, I know, it's a good sign. Hobby Lobby, as I mentioned, used that one little remnant of the RFRA that remained at the federal level to claim a massive religious exemption. And that religious exemption was from the Affordable Care Act's contraceptive mandate. Now, I'm sure all of you have some memory of this as it was going on. The contraceptive mandate simply required employers to provide contraception to women as part of their health care. Now, already there were religious exemptions to this. Churches and other explicitly religious organizations did not have to do this, and neither did explicitly religious nonprofits like the University of Notre Dame. So this really left already a fairly narrow set of companies that had to follow this mandate: for-profit corporations, non-religious for-profit. And Hobby Lobby challenged that. And they challenged it by saying, hey, we are owned by one family, and our family believes that some of the contraception you're asking us to distribute are functionally abortions, and that's dissonant with our religion. We don't want to give those out to our employees. Now, it is important, I think, to have in the back of your mind an idea of what Hobby Lobby is as a corporation. At the time of this case in 2014, they had about 32,000 employees, over $4 billion in annual revenue. So it goes without saying, this is not the kind of religious actor that the original RFRA was designed to protect. Those laws were designed to protect the little guy, to protect Native Americans who wanted to continue with a centuries-old ritual, not to protect a multi-billion-dollar company. However, activists on both sides of this case said this very moment marks a slippery slope. So on the side of Hobby Lobby, you had lawyers saying, if the government can make this family, through their store, give women abortions, which is how they viewed it religiously, then it's just a short time until the government is going to start telling every individual how they are going to need to go against their own religious beliefs, how they're going to need to act morally. And of course, on the other side of it, activists said, this is a slippery slope because religious exemption laws that are designed to protect small minority groups can now be leveraged by massive corporations to opt out of generally applicable laws. And they do so by actively burdening others, in this case by burdening taxpayers with then having to provide contraception instead. So one scholar framed it in such a compelling way. On some level, the question here was, is Hobby Lobby more like a church or more like ExxonMobil? And the court wound up saying it's more like a church, it's more like a person, and it has rights too. And so the Hobby Lobby case marked just a wild expansion of the idea of religious freedom from being something that is the natural-born right of an individual to something that can also be the natural-born right of a corporation. And I'll be honest with you, I think a lot of people, a lot of scholars were very, very nervous after the Hobby Lobby case. There have not yet been major ramifications from this, aside from this case. And so that's another one that I, for one, am going to really keep my ear to the ground on, in the coming years to see whether the ripple effects that were anticipated by this massive shift actually come to pass.
Thank you. Is there a difference between the terms evangelical and fundamentalism and Protestantism? These seem to be blended in the national conversation. Is that true?
It is absolutely true. That is such a good question to raise. They are blended in the national conversation for a reason. Neither of those is an actual denomination. It's not like Baptists or Methodists or Presbyterians. Rather, they're kind of flavors of Christianity. And so I would say that fundamentalism and evangelicalism are a bit of a Venn diagram. Fundamentalism, I would say, is more about a relationship to the Bible as being inerrant, about a loyalty to very specific ideas like creationism, whereas evangelicalism brings with it a sense of a certain social movement, a movement that very much sees Christianity as playing a necessary and enormous part in the nation's public life. There are some great texts that try to tease out this language, but what I can say for now is if you are confused by it, that is okay. Those are really, really amorphous terms.
Okay, last thing. Can you elaborate on how religion is defined?
Absolutely. What a great question. So this has kind of plagued America since its early days. Let's go back to the Parliament of Religions to think about this for a moment. The way that many Protestants, certainly through the 1900s, certainly through the 1800s rather, and well into the 1900s, would define religion looked suspiciously like Protestantism. They would say, okay, religion involves a belief in a divine being. Religion is about building a personal spiritual connection with that divine being. Religion is internal. It involves self-reflection. Religion involves a relationship to a text. Now, even if we just step far enough away to look at Catholicism in comparison to Protestantism, we can see that that's a little problematic, because many Catholics would say, religion for me is primarily about being part of a community. And the way that I connect with the divine is not by reading the Bible, or is not by, introspective prayer. It's by participating in communal ritual. It is taking communion. It is listening to the liturgy. It's participating in these festivals that move through the streets. That's how I connect with the divine. So already we can see an issue there. And I think ways in which this starts to kind of blossom in American law, in posing problems for religious freedom, is when things that don't seem religious to Protestants sure do seem religious to other people. So for example, I'll draw on my own research here, meat. Protestantism does not have rules about how your meat has to be slaughtered or who you need to buy it from. But if you are Jewish and you keep kosher, you do care about that, and it is a religious issue. And if you're Muslim and you keep halal, you do care about that. It is religious. And so general laws that don't seem religious to the Protestant majority that created them may actually seem like they're really interfering with religion for non-Protestant groups. So that's just one tiny example of how in a kind of day-to-day way there could be a clash between categories there. This issue of religion being defined in very Protestant terms is also one that's just a huge problem for religious studies. And I think it's really just in the last few decades that the discipline of religious studies has kind of been actively trying to shed the ways in which it has historically taken a Protestant lens and used that to look at non-Protestant religions.
Thank you, Joanna. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was such a pleasure to be here.